sitten mä yritän...
Jos mä sanon silleen, että mehän nyt kerrotaan tästä meidän konsortiosta, että voi tavallaan myös sen takia, että ihmiset voi myöhemmin just osallistua tämän toimintaan, siis onkin aktiivisesti, eikö sille voi sanoa?
Joo, että jos ne niinku tunnistaa sieltä semmoisia keywordeja tai on muuten inspiroituu jostain, niin on meihin yhteydessä ja vaan jotenkin sanoisin, että kaikki on niin alussa. Mutta että silti tämä on niin continuation, joka on erityisasia niin kaikilla kolmella. Ja sitten jos muistat sanoa sen, että tämä on niin tietyllä tavalla, että tämä on ensisijaisesti tuon verkostokonferenssi, mutta että nyt musta saatiin se konserttirahoitus, mutta että tämä on suoraan sitä. Että tämä on niin co-sponsored, vaikka me ei mitään rahaa ei ole kyllä konsortio tähän antanut. Se ei voi sanoa co-sponsored, kun ei ole rahaa annettu.
Projekti on vähän sellainen takaportti, että jos siellä se on aina vähän vaikea tarkkaan tietää, että jos se liittyy budjettiin, se menee voi käyttää sitä.
Ja jos rahat loppuu, niin todellakaan ei tarvitse mun osallistua. Mä voin maksaa jälkikäteen oman osallistumismaksun. Ja illallisen. Andrean esitelmä on tosi älykäs. Siis mä en ole ennen kuin mä en myöskään näistä tavannut. Molemmat oli todella ja semmosia ihanan ja kuitenkin niinku auki, semmoista work in progress-tyyppistä puhumista. Sopii musta hyvin noihin keynote-hetkiin.
Mitä suurin piirtein 5 pinsaa saadaan?
Mitä?
5 pinsaa puhutaan jokainen omasta projektista.
Joo.
Saattaa mennä vähän vähemmän.
Hei pieniä. Mitä? Viiteen. Mä ajattelin jotenkin, että toi Greta ja nyt, tai kukaan myöskään kuitenkaan valmistanut mitään, niin se on vähän sellainen, tietenkin se on tärkeää, että saa jotain sanoja näin, mutta ei ole niinku... Tää on kyllä tää 3 varttia aika vähän. Kuinka osallistu sun menee?
No kun mä niinku ihan ehdottomasti sit lopetan 10 yli. Et jos me aloitetaan nyt heti, niin mä yritän olla tiukka, kun mulla just tosi helposti käy se, että mä vaan niinku jauhan. Ja sitten kun mä jotenkin liian väsyneenä tein niitä slideja eilen, niin niihin tuli tosiaan vähän liikaa sitä asiaa. Niin sitten kun mä jäin rankuttaa aina jostain yhdestä kohdasta, niin mä yritän pitää huolen, että mä lopetan 10 yli.
Sä työ niin muassa, jos mä just puhunut, kun meillä on semmoista oikeesti cherry, jonka olisi käyttää cherrystä kuitenkin.
Niin. Ja tässä on niinku sekin vaikeeta, että se on aina vaikeeta, että jos pohjalla on hakemus tietyllä tavalla. Ja sitten ei ole kuitenkaan sitä yhteisötutkimusta vielä. Ja sitten on tosi paljon miettinyt vain sen hakemuksen kannalta. Niin sitten tässä tilanteessa on yleensä ihan liemessä, että mitä on tullut niinku luvattua. Että kuulostaako se realistiselta sen niinku oikean yleisön edessä. The mics need to be turned on. Yeah. Each and every one of the mics.
Sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks very much for having me here for
Well, of course,
this
you.
experiment. I mean,
You were the obvious
you were the
choice.
real.
Ja ajatteko te istua koko ajan vai?
Mä ehkä istun, kun mä oon aivan sairaan väsynyt. Ja sitten että se, että mä saan luettua itse niin kuin noista mun slideista, että mitä niissä lukee, ettei mä ihan ristiriitaiseksi. Niin tarvii varmaan jotenkin oikeastikin istua. Ja.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. Let's start the roundtable. So we have a roundtable on instrumental narratives. So one of the co-organizers of this symposium is this new Academy of Finland consortium, even though it's primarily by the network Narrative Memory, but since we got this funding and we realized that there are a lot of connections actually between the topic of the conference and the new consortium, so we thought it's a great opportunity to share with you what our plans are in this consortium, which is still in a very beginning phase. So all feedback is very welcome. And in the morning, Greta Olson mentioned these 3 women professors. So in case you were wondering who they are, we are the 3 proud women professors.
One professor.
But anyway, so it's a consortium between Turku, Tampere, and Helsinki, and Maria Mäkelä is the PI of the whole consortium and the Tampere team. I'm the PI of the Turku team, and Merja Polvinen is the PI of the Helsinki team. So we will all tell a little bit about our own sub-projects, and Maria will present the sort of idea behind the consortium. And Greta Olson was supposed to be a commentator in this roundtable, but because she fell ill, Jens Brockmeyer kindly agreed to replace her, and both Greta and Jens are partners in this project, and also there are other members in the audience who are international partners of the project. So we thought it's also an opportunity to invite you to participate or join us in the future events of the consortiums, just so that you know what we are planning to do, and if there's anything that really resonates with your own interests, just please approach us, and any suggestions of collaboration are very welcome as well. Okay, and in the discussion I also hope that we will be able to continue a little bit some of the discussions that have been already sort of in the keynotes particularly, and also in some of the parallel sessions, these issues of how narrative scholars might contribute to current discussion in society and politics, like what could be the contribution of narrative scholars, that kind of issues. I hope we will get back to them as well in this roundtable. But now, Maria, please.
Thank you, Hanna. Good afternoon, everybody. I tried to collect some of the main ideas of the consortium in 2 slides, but it's always awfully difficult if the intertext that you have or the subtext that you have is an application. And then you really try to figure out what can we actually do and present that in front of an actual audience who really knows about storytelling and narrative. So we are not selling anything anymore, but we are genuinely trying to figure out what we promised and what is possible. So one of the starting points for this consortium is the idea that maybe narratology and narrative theory would benefit from this new paradigm of story-critical narratology. And this is a narratological response to the current ideas of post-truth and other and also the so-called storytelling boom. So one of the key questions behind the whole application process and of the idea of the story-critical narrative theory is that storytelling boom is generating this general story positivity around us. And nevertheless, we should think of the question whether good intentions coupled with narrative form would always result in good things. And in social sciences, in social scientific study of narratives, there have been some critical voices toward this all-encompassing positivity. For example, Sujata Fernandez, in her book Curated Stories, asks whether these well-meaning curated stories might actually inhibit social change. And another important scholar here is Amy Schumann, who has in her book Other People's Stories criticized the idea of empathy that is embedded in our understanding, popular understanding of telling one's own story or telling the other person's story. And one of the most wonderful and resonating ideas by Schumann is that in today's storytelling culture and in the storytelling boom, oftentimes another person's tragedy becomes another person's inspiration. And that is something that we might be able to combat against with narrative theoretical means. But this, then we require some sort of rethinking of the methodological toolbox or whatever you want to call it. Some of the hypotheses in our consortium is that one of the dangers of narrative, so to say, are compelling cultural masterplots and compelling cultural narrative identities. And one of our hypotheses would be that, and especially in the Turku team, that is a continuation of Hanna's previous work, to investigate how story-critical or meta-narrative fiction can question and challenge the compelling cultural masterplots. And the other topic for us, and especially in the Tampere team, is the story logic of social media and how the often moralistic and even sort of like medieval type of storytelling situations and what I've started to call the viral exemplum, these exemplary narratives of individual hardship, how they might contribute to the idea of post-truth politics and so on. So that's my field, basically. And then other more general topics, the dominance of the individualistic, moralistic, experiential narrative prototype in today's the storytelling boom. And the last one here would be the limits of narrative and life storying. And here, especially the Helsinki team will investigate the potential of speculative fiction to go beyond the narrative form and depict human experience at the limits. So this harks back to the question of why speculative fiction is such a dominant form of novelistic presentation today, but at the same time it challenges narrative form oftentimes. So another question, why instrumental? So having to do with the storytelling boom, we should ask about the contemporary instrumental uses of storytelling. Will everyone be eventually telling the same compelling, curated, or viral story? That is something that we seem to perceive in the surrounding culture, and especially internet cultures, that different actors, whether they are they have marketing intentions or whether they have good intentions, political intentions, everybody seems to tell a similar type of compelling story. That is also, people are trained to be storytellers, and these are also the curated stories that Fernandez is discussing in her book. And the idea of instrumentality is twofold in the consortium, because we are studying the instrumental uses of storytelling in society and culture, but we are also taking a new angle to the instrumental uses of narrative fiction. So, for example, in Hanna's team, narratives are rethought in identity work. So what would be the critical and self-reflexive potential in narrative fiction toward or with regard to the storytelling boom, where everybody's forced to be a storyteller, everybody's forced to tell one story. So what's the critical potential in meta-narrative or story-critical fiction? And a much larger topic still, and a bit more philosophical one, has to do with narrative truth and knowledge. versus complexity and the non-human scale. And this is something that especially the Helsinki team will address with its focus on speculative fiction. And then the general idea that we need to think about the role of fiction in today's storytelling culture, whether it's something distinct or is fiction just contributing to this idea of everybody being tellers of their own stories and so on. So what we would like to develop is the idea of fiction as an analytical instrument. So not a moral lesson or nothing that straightforward, but the idea of reading fiction giving analytical instruments to deal with the storytelling boom, and also in a very, very critical way. And also fiction's ability to go beyond narrative. And also another large topic would be the tacit notions of narrative. If everybody is referring to themselves as storytellers, or, for example, when I raised the question of the populist use of the term narrative after Greta's talk, so that you can respond to another person that, so that's your narrative. So that there is a tacit notion of what a narrative is in that sense. So if used in that way, a narrative can be understood as a selective, ideologically selective process, something that you can go beyond, but the other one can't. So that's a very interesting tacit notion of narrative that differs from the hermeneutic understanding of narrative. For example, there's huge difference there. And finally, one of our aims is to develop and apply, in a way, an applied narrative theory for a general use of larger audiences and also professional groups that need to tackle with the consequences of the storytelling boom, like educators at schools, or the actual storytellers who need to come up with new, compelling ways of telling stories. So we are not going to train spin doctors or new consultants, maybe, or maybe yes, if we run out of money at some point. But this is something that I've been already doing, so I'll just show something that I have already done with our Tampere group. So this consortium project started in August 2018, but before that I started with this project called Dangers of Narrative in January 2017. We set up a Facebook page through which we crowdsourced dubious uses of storytelling so that people could report back to us. And today we have 6,600 followers on our Facebook page, and we have more than 600 reports by people of dubious uses of storytelling with their accompanying words, which is really the most interesting part. They are not just reporting a story, but they are also telling why it's dubious, why it's dangerous, and also they reflect the tacit notions of what people consider to be a narrative. So this is the material that the Tampere team will be working on mostly, and in comparison with the fictions that the Turku and Helsinki teams are working on, so that we get this interesting double setup here, so that we have the danger stories going viral and circulating in culture, and then we have interesting, complex fictions, and we try to see whether the fictions can challenge the dangerous narratives generated by the overall storytelling boom. So just one very small example of the type of stories that we might receive. We have actually found this one genre that we call the conversion story of a life coach, because they are so frequent. We have dozens of stories that are conversion stories of a life coach. So I just wanted to quote this one headline from a news website of the national broadcasting company Yle. So just to give you a picture of the narrative identities, the compelling narrative identities produced by today's journalism. So the headline goes like this: willingness to help others is a virtue, but it can also drain you. Having done charity work for years, a man from Turku tries to learn how to say no. Thank you. So that was all about Tampere, because we're running out of time. So I will it be Hanna first?
Yeah.
Okay.
First Hanna.
Yeah.
It's over there.
Yeah, okay. So the Turku team, I think it's okay, I can, yeah. So what we are doing, some of the main questions we start with are, what does it mean to live in the current age of storytelling, by which I mean not just this, not just the sort of narrative turn in the humanities, but this really widespread story talk all over society in virtually all areas of our lives. We face this pressure to kind of condense our lives into these easily shareable and sellable stories. And what does it mean? And how are narratives used and abused, particularly in relation to construction of identities, both personal and collective identities? And as Merja mentioned, we are particularly interested in how contemporary narrative fiction responds to this situation, and how it has these particular self-reflexive dimensions through which it reflects critically on this situation. What does it mean to be surrounded by these certain kinds of narrative pressures and these dominant narrative models that are imposed on us, and this sort of normative pressure to have this sort of coherent and linear narrative identity that is easily shareable. There you can see the whole team. On some of them are funded by the project, and some have other kind of funding. And so basically the project has two parts. The first part is more theoretical, focuses on kind of theoretical reflection on meta-narrativity and narrative agency. So these are kind of two key concepts that in a way derive from my earlier research, but we want to sort of expand on them and develop them further. And the other one focuses on reading groups. So the first part, meta-narrativity, with this concept, I mean something else than it is it's usually used in a bit different sense. So usually meta-narratives, as for example this morning Andrea talked about meta-narratives, so usually it means this Lyothardian idea of master narratives, what Lyotard called grand narratives, grand récits, are usually translated as master narratives or meta-narratives. But in my view, meta-narrative is in a way a bit problematic term for that idea, because the prefix meta suggests that they are narratives about narratives in a sense. And this is what I mean by meta-narrativity. So narratives that have this self-reflexive dimension, that they actually reflect on the significance and roles of stories in our lives and these cultural models of narrative sense-making. And then another common use of meta-narrative in narratology, people like Nünning and Fludernik use it with reference to narrators that reflect on their own process of narrating, but that's also a very limited sense. So we are more interested in this sort of broader cultural relevance of these narratives that self-reflexively reflect on the significance and roles of these cultural narrative models in our lives. And in a way, the underlying idea is that these kind of narratives could have emancipatory potential in that they make us more aware of this narrative, sort of repertoire of narrative models that are dominant and imposed in our lives, so that we might be able to have critical distance to them and find alternative ways of narrating our experiences. Okay, and then the other key concept is narrative agency. So this concept has been used, for example, by Mackenzie to refer particularly to emphasize the role of narrative self-interpretation in bringing into bringing about what she calls integration of the self over time. And in my earlier book, The Ethics of Storytelling, I sort of try to expand, use it in a bit different sense, and see it as relevant not only to a process of self-interpretation, but more widely to the constitution of subjectivity. So it's a constitutive aspect of moral agency as we constantly participate through our actions and inactions in narrative practices that perpetuate and challenge social structures. And that it could be a useful concept in signaling not only that the way we interpret ourselves and the world is mediated by these cultural narrative models, but also that subjectivity is both, as subjects we are both constituting and constituted, so it's socially conditioned, this whole process of narrative interpretation. And what we are particularly interested in this project is how this kind of meta-narrative fiction that has this critical dimension, how it could sort of amplify narrative agency, so our ability to navigate these narrative environments in which we live in the contemporary world. And then finally, the second part of the project focuses on reading groups. In a way, we have the bibliotherapy in the title, but it's maybe a bit like slightly too ambitious term in the sense that we start with non-therapeutic reading groups, and then the idea is that perhaps eventually it could, what we find out in the project could be also applied in actual bibliotherapy. But the researchers here who are mainly responsible for this, Päivi Kossonen and Eeva-Stina Kinnunen. You know Eeva-Stina very well from this other role as a conference secretary, but she's also, and both Päivi and Eeva-Stina are both trained bibliotherapists as well. And so we have this spring this course where we train our students in comparative literature and psychology students, so both literature and psychology students together, to facilitate different kinds of reading groups, and they will run these groups in the autumn, and that they will gather material for this project. And there they will try this kind of meta-narrative reading group, or meta-narrative reading method, which is still in a kind of planning phase, but the idea is to test how this kind of material, reading together in a facilitated way, this meta-narrative fiction, and reflect on this issue of what kind of story or narrative cultural models surround us, and how we tell our own stories in relation to these kind of discussions. How does it have like potential to amplify narrative agency in this sense? And one of the hypotheses also, that's kind of in a way my hypothesis from my earlier work, which has always been really theoretical. So this is why it's quite exciting also for me to sort of see if some of it can be applied to practice or sort of empirically tested. But one of my hypotheses is that experiences of perplexion, confusion, ambiguity can contribute to personal growth of individuals in ways that current therapeutic culture and discussions on well-being overlook. So often well-being is understood in rather sort of narrow sense, in kind of feel-good, kind of endorphin kind of way, but actually kind of broader understanding of well-being and agency might actually benefit more from this kind of uncomfortable experiences of reading something that kind of challenges you and makes you really look at things from a new perspective. So this is the kind of things that we will be trying to do. Thanks.
Okay. Helsinki team, could you bring up my faces? The Helsinki team happens to be one that is probably working with material that is kind of less immediately familiar or graspable than any of the ones that we've been talking about so far, which is why I wanted to bring the creatures who are actually doing this work, actually somehow bring them into the room. Two of them are actually physically present. Bo Pettersson gave a paper yesterday, and so did Jouni. So there we are. But the team that I'm working with is mostly, as Maria said, working to go beyond the realist and into kind of speculative fictions. What we're mostly interested in is how the kind of different kinds of textual and narrative techniques and dynamics that speculative narratives use, how they could be seen to be grasping the ungraspable, representing the unrepresentable. Both in terms of how we deal with our environment, things like the Anthropocene and climate change and these sort of massive scale events that are very difficult for human experience to grasp, but also then human experiences of those kinds of experiences. So it's not only the environment as is, but also how we experience something that we feel is the other, is ungraspable, is just too big or too strange. The projects that we have range from sort of, Bo Pettersson, who's on your right, top right-hand corner, was talking about animal narratives yesterday, and that's his focus is on how we create storylines and representations of sort of non-human animal experience and what follows to our understanding of narrativity as human experience from those kinds of stories. Kaisa Kortekallio, who's surrounded by green, and it's a good thing that she is writing about sort of very much in post-humanist vein about non-human experiences of the natural world. She's also experimenting on different kinds of ways in which academic writing and the kind of post-human thinking could be tied together. So not only just writing academically the way everybody else writes about post-humanism, but she's trying to figure out ways of writing post-humanistically about the post-human. Hanna-Riikka Roine, who's next on the top row, works with digital narratives a lot. Mostly she works with kind of, at the moment, with communal creativity. What does it mean for narratives to be constructed and consumed and shared in online environments in ways in which the authorship of authorship in the way that we usually understand it in narrative studies gets mixed and messed up in those situations. Jouni Teittinen gave a paper yesterday on post-apocalyptic novels. I now finally know how to say that word, hopefully for the forthcoming future. And is particularly interested in the movement of time and how temporalities are twisted, complicated, made strange in those kinds of narratives. Then looping back down to the bottom row, on the left-hand side, in the sunglasses, is Esko Suoranta, who's working in Helsinki on narratives about, speculative narratives about work and about technology, about how is it that the kinds of narratives or narrative means that we now have can help us understand the kind of post-capitalistic world or late capitalist world that we live in. Parker Krieg works on petrol fictions and accelerationism, if those mean anything to you. But mostly, again, similar kinds of things as Esko, that there is a sense in which the way we think about work, the way we think about the use of natural resources has very particular problems when we try to put it in narrative form. And on the other hand, narrative form allows us perhaps new ways of trying to grasp these very, very complicated issues about how do we use up our planetary resources. Tommi Laine there is our research assistant working on Shakespeare and Shakespearean spaces, gendered spaces in particular. And then there's me at the end. And my particular interest in the project is mainly just on how we can think about the narrative format as something that helps us to grasp the non-human form of narrative itself. So I'm really interested in self-reflective narratives and how that kind of sense in which we are within a narrative space is an imaginary space where we are still trying to grasp at something that is not actually there. I'll finish by bringing up something that actually came up partly in and I'm bringing Jens in here with this particular thing, is what came up when you were presenting yesterday on the idea of memory and autobiographical memory and what counts as autobiographical memory in a narrative that very, very sort of complicatedly layers these many things in a single paragraph. And also something that came up in plenaries both yesterday and today, and in Maria's and Hanna's presentations as well, which is the idea of difficulty. And the layeredness and the difficulty are things that I'm massively interested in, and hopefully will be able to work sort of to deal with. But the question that I would kind of throw out at am I allowed to do the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think Jens should also be allowed to ask something, but you can
Absolutely.
start.
I'll ask you first, and then you can ask us. Deal?
Okay.
So my question would be this sort of, if we take the hypothesis that yes, reading complicated narratives, complicated fictions, is and being with that uncertainty that Hanna was talking about, if we accept that that is good for us, if we accept that the kinds of texts that you were looking at are in some senses developing our capability and making us better in many kinds of senses, how do we get people to read those texts if the immediate experience is still that of discomfort? How do we sell that to readers? Mm-hmm. Or how are we able to get a hold of the ways in which difficult narratives can still be pleasurable?
And difficult narratives never go viral. You cannot share complexity or ambivalence. Yeah, just.
Okay. Thank you.
You have to solve our problem.
The questions now are the answers. Well, I must say I know this for a few hours that I'm summarizing 72 contributions to this project. 3 teams, 3 biggest cities in Finland with, well, it feels like 48 narratologists. And I have now 3 minutes to summarize it all. We'll do this in the spirit of Woody Allen, who, as you might remember, once did, in late 70s, this famous course in fast reading. Sort of 2 weeks or 3 weeks he went there, and then he famously stated that he is now good at fast reading, and as a proof he referred to the night before when he read in one night War and Peace. He said, I did it, sort of. It was actually only 4 hours, and it's War and Peace. It's good. It's about Russia. This is a bit my attitude now, and I will say a few words about Russia. But on the other hand, of course, we are in Finland, and we start with Finland. So I, first of all, want to express the same reaction that I think most of you feel. This is just a fantastic project, and it's just wonderful that this was accepted and that this takes off and is already flying, and so many people for so many years will get sort of a focus, and we all, of course, are very excited that we somehow can, follow and see what comes out of it, because most of those questions that you've asked, including the very difficult one at the end, are questions we all have. And so what is so great about this project, I mean, typically you would say size doesn't matter, but here maybe it matters because there's so many people in the world out there, outside of Turku, also the world working on narrative, that's very difficult to get a homogeneous, a coherent picture at all. So what actually, are there trends, are there tendencies? It depends on very much where you are in the field, and this is one position. It could be one spot for a couple of years, be the arithmetic point, because you have very many different traditions and approaches and orientations working together here for a couple of years. So at least they, you would think, should be able to communicate and talk to each other, all the more as they all speak the secret language of narrative, that is Finnish, as you know. And therefore, this alone gives it an enormous momentum. So the second thing is why I think it's fantastic. In the, as I said, narrative landscape, in the worldscape, you have so many different tendencies that I don't think it's possible to even claim to give an overview. But still, I would say why it is so difficult to say what's going on. Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, at the beginning, the first 20, 30 years were still nice, registered by Matti Häviring, all the different turns, and just the idea that it's not just a narrative turn, but there are many narrative turns, and went through the couple of humanities and social sciences, and then arrived in medicine and law and other disciplines. So there are by now so many more disciplines also out in the world. I mean, who would be able to say in one word what is the discipline of Greta Olson? There's visual, figurative, theoretical reflection as a discipline probably out there in the world. And she had 4 or 5, these very cutting-edge disciplines, and they're all fascinating. But of course, most people don't know that they are, and you don't know about many disciplines that have developed their own narrative approaches, their own ways to react to narrative. And you have a new kind of narrative fields where you apply to business, marketing, school, health, doctor-patient interaction out of linguistics that has developed to an own narrative field. You have a huge explosion, I would say, in the field of media studies, multimedia, and multimedia semiotic environments, so which is as complicated as a modern installation in modern arts. So this all is being connected to narrative trends, narrative exploration. You have different theoretical approaches. You mentioned hermeneutics. You have cognitive sciences or cognitive studies or cognitive approaches. You have traditional analytical philosophy that has discovered or is about to discover narrative. And you have finally, to finish this up, the discovery that you have actually already, for quite a while, a number of different cultural and national traditions of narrative. So Monika Fludenig, she will tell you very precisely what is the difference between the Austrian and the German tradition of narratology over the last 60, 80 years. Complete different ball game if you come to France. Of course, France, in terms of narrative, invented it all, at least that's what the meaning is of most French narratologists. In reality, however, this all happened in Nebraska. And at the University of Ohio, in particular, for 20, 30 years, this so-called project narrative was really the only thing what actually I could remember was able to bring together almost 50 narratologists under the leadership of David Herman. But apart from that, you have very much now local traditions. I met some colleagues from India and said, we do something completely different from our colleagues in Pakistan. Don't mix this up. Would never do this. But this makes it so difficult, and at least we have a number of people here that have followed many of these fields and areas and bring this together in one discourse. So what I just described is, we had this morning already these nice terms, the deficit of memory and the excess of memory. This was the excess of narrative, so to speak. We also have a kind of, to change the words, this was the extension of narrative. We also have a tendency that I would associate with the term intention or intentionality. Intention in terms of it goes more into details. So all what I just mentioned is actually not the real narratology. These are things that happen in different disciplines. The real narratology is something what you find, for example, in the International Society for the Study of Narrative. Most of these people are not even literary critics or literary theorists, but they are explicit narratologists. They have their own tradition, in which originally, I think it all started somehow, everything started somehow with Aristotle, of course. But then again, the French, Genet in particular, defined the terms of the games, and most of these scholars work with categories that come out of this tradition. So I was as happy or unhappy, depends on, attend 4 or 5 different sessions in Montreal last year at the International Society for Narrative on what actually is the most important thing in narrative. The narrator, the narrative I, the author, the implied narrator, or there is no narrator at all. These were 5 different theses, hypotheses, and they were all presented in a way that I would say I was convinced that all these 5 things. So I came out and said, gosh, this is something I sort of had. They all have, of course, 20 years more narratological detail analysis behind them, their work. And so this tendency goes on independently from this tendency. And it goes even on, in a sense, sort of in a kind of, now we'll show them. Or everybody talks about narrative, but what we do is basically it's close to a science. Physics, of course, is hard to reach, but the standards are almost that high, and we go on. So there is a certain ethos of kind of this is the real thing, the real narratology. Now, it is true. Most people we know are either in this first field, extension, sort of applied in different fields, or in this field of intention, sort of real, true narratology in the traditional Genet or post-Genet line. But there are very few who sort of know what's going on in both areas. It's already difficult to see what's going on in one area and the other. But the very few, David Herman is someone who certainly was very well familiar with social, scientific, and narratological discourses. But I think the few that we have now around in this world who have done work in both areas are sitting here at this table and are collaborating in this project. All of them have done work in both areas. All of them, in a sense, bring their expertise and their curiosities and their projects, hopes, and fears together in this new project. And
lots of fears.
Do you think I should talk about time as well?
That was a meta moment.
I think I'll leave it at this moment and emphasize again my great pleasure and my great joy to see that this project has taken off ground. And, well, we all wish you very well.
Thank you. We've run out of time, but I still want to thank your very generous comments. And I just wanted to mention that in actually the proposal we emphasize that precisely because we come from so different traditions, and even understanding what narrative is so different from all of us. I'm not a narratologist. She's the president of the Narratological Society, or whatever it's called. And so we really are very different. But we said that this is going to be what's special about this, that this will be like a site of debate and dispute. So we don't agree about things, but I think that's going to be why it's going to be fun. And finally, you had something to...
I want to extend an invitation to you, because one of the aims of the project is obviously to land this like as widely as possible, so that we can actually teach people how to read story critically, right? So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and now I'm asking you whether this would even be possible, because we would like to have a visitor blog, an international blog, where all of our everybody sitting here and all of our colleagues would be invited to contribute very short popularizing analysis of some sort of like danger of narrative or instrumental use of storytelling, perhaps in their own culture or otherwise an internationally interesting, provocative example. So would you be willing and ready to contribute to this kind of popularizing thing? I know nobody has time. No one has time, but I'm talking of a text that would be like this length and a popularizing text for the general audience in English, so that we could also have comparative material from different countries on what goes viral, what kind of instrumental storytelling is affecting political decision-making at the moment in the culture where you're embedded in. So this is something that I think narratologists are doing too little at the moment. In Dangers of Narrative, we post this popularizing analysis of the cases that people send in, and that has made us popular, and that has made us a very not important. I can't say important about myself, but people listen.